So the BBC is in crisis. Its leadership has resigned after a leaked memo linked to the right-wing Daily Telegraph, authored by Michael Prescott, a former Sunday Times political correspondent turned corporate lobbyist, who was presented as a independent analyst, I guess, when it comes to editorial policy at the BBC. Now, the most high-profile thing, of course, that came out of that was to do with how a speech by Donald Trump during the Capitol insurrection was presented. Donald Trump did incite an insurrection, just so we're absolutely clear, although the editing was definitely bad. But the overall impression in terms of what actually Donald Trump did was not misrepresented. But we're not going to get stuck into that, because one of the other key aspects was, of course, to do with the BBC's coverage of Israel-Palestine, to do with what a consensus of genocide scholars describe as a genocide, as well as a UN commission, so on and so forth. Now, according to this memo, we would now have to conclude that the BBC has some sort of anti-Israel bias, which flies in the face, I'm sure, of what a lot of you have seen and heard, but more importantly, what the objective statistical analysis says over and over again. But look, more importantly, Karishma Patel, who joins me, the brilliant Karishma Patel, is a former BBC journalist / BBC presenter who knows all of this inside out. And she's really been out there just in the most methodological... how do I say that word, Karishma? I've just lost the ability to speak. Forensic. Very forensic in her analysis of the BBC and its hideous, I would say, I'm allowed to say that, failings when it comes to violating its own policies, its own editorial policies and due impartiality when it comes to Israel's genocide. Karishma, it's great to speak to you. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm doing a lot worse after reading Prescott's memo, I have to admit.
Well, you've been doing the work there, which is hugely important. We have to talk about this because the narrative, which much of the media, which of course is complicit itself in whitewashing, lying in many cases about the genocide that Israel committed, they presented a particular narrative. I just want your overall kind of takeaway of, in terms of what Michael Prescott's leaked memo said about the BBC's coverage, and just your, summing up and what do you say to that as somebody who knows this inside out in terms of the BBC's coverage?
Yeah, I mean, he obviously talks about lots of different topics. So he talks about this Panorama documentary and a misleading edit around Trump's speech. Fair enough. It was a misleading edit. The problem now, though, and I think it was put really well by Ben DePere, actually, he said that the purpose of this dossier is to smuggle in the distortion that the BBC's coverage has been anti-Israel. So,
and just so everyone's clear, Ben DePere is a former editor of Channel 4 News who went on to produce a documentary on the Gaza medics, which the BBC did refuse to broadcast.
Exactly. And, while his criticisms of Panorama are, they're fairly valid, it is not the case that his other criticisms, his other allegations are valid. And the things he's basically saying about the BBC's Gaza coverage, his claims sort of amount to saying that the BBC is anti-Israel. Well, they're just not accurate. And it's a massive mischaracterization of the BBC's actual Gaza coverage. And I think at this point, I'm really concerned that because his allegations around the Panorama documentary and Trump's speech have been treated with a certain levity, and because there was a misleading edit there, I'm really concerned that people are going to look at what he's saying about the Gaza coverage and take that really seriously. And I'm here to talk about why they absolutely shouldn't.
So a lot of his analysis focused on the BBC Arabic service, which is, obviously is an important part of the BBC, but is obviously a relatively very small slither in practice of the BBC's output. But, they have journalists who have done very important work. But he makes a comparison between BBC Arabic and the output of the English language news website, which is the biggest online news source on earth. Just FYI, everyone. What's your take on what he did there?
Yeah, I think his methodology is entirely flawed. So he's looking at BBC Arabic's coverage. He's not comparing it to the editorial policy. He's comparing it to the English website. And as we know, the English website has been one of the worst offenders in terms of the BBC's Gaza coverage. You know, we've periodically seen headlines that will leave Israel out when it's the perpetrator of certain crimes. We've seen entire articles framed around Israel's response, Israel's right of reply. All of these issues we've seen on the website across 2 years. So to then compare BBC Arabic to, you know, the English page and to conclude that BBC Arabic is doing something wrong is an incredibly flawed way to approach it. It's also the case that BBC Arabic has an entirely different audience. It's catering to entirely different people. And that's meant to be part of the function of the BBC. You know, there's this global aspect to it. So I think from the off, what he's saying is entirely wrong there. And actually, he's basing it off of a report by a man called David Grossman from the BBC, and it's his methodology. And for some reason, Prescott has not fully questioned that.
And I mean, just in terms of the BBC website, because I mean, the statistics themselves are damning, because the Centre for Media Monitoring looked at the output of the BBC, overall BBC reporting, and they found, you know, I mean, in terms of how much reporting an Israeli killing received to a Palestinian killing. I mean, there was just a huge amount of disparity, a massive chasm of disparity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they did a sort of forensic analysis, I think, of over 35,000 pieces of BBC content. And they found that the BBC, you know, for example, BBC presenters shared Israeli perspectives 11 times more frequently than Palestinian perspectives, or Israeli deaths were given 33 times more coverage per fatality than Palestinians. And when you look at that, you realize the extent to which the BBC's really failed to communicate, you know, the gravity, the scale, the disproportionality, the illegality of Israel's actions. And you can really see that so clearly in, you know, in the numbers in that report.
I mean, just in terms of that, the death toll in, you know, and in terms of how that's been presented, we've seen all the way through attempts to denigrate the statistics, the official statistics which have come out of Gaza, when actually we'll talk about this, the overwhelming evidence shows it's a massive and the rest of it. But so the argument made by Michael Prescott is about the death toll being exaggerated. Do you want to just accept, what's his claim and what's the actual reality here?
Yeah, so he's making the claim that in mid-2024, the UN revised down how many women and children were killed in Gaza. And he claims that the BBC gave unjustifiable weight to that figure. And that figure was that 70% of Palestinians killed by Israel were women and children. Now, what has actually happened there is that the UN sort of amended the death toll to reflect that many bodies couldn't be fully identified. And that's it's not uncommon in a live genocide. Generally speaking, in any sort of live conflict, you're going to have difficulty identifying people. And actually, in fact, when questioned, the spokesperson for the UN Secretary General did reaffirm the accuracy of the deaths recorded by Gaza's health ministry. And we know that, you know, they have been widely historically relied upon by aid organizations, by Israel itself. And they actually outlined that this revised figure just sort of reflected an updated breakdown of how many deaths had actually been fully identified. So it's more about that than about the health ministry being overall unreliable. It's a little bit more complex than that. But the other thing that we really do know is that the Israeli military's own data shows that over 80% of Palestinians killed by Israel were civilians. And that's it was an investigation by The Guardian, Local Call, and Plus 972 magazine.
Who are an Israeli-Palestinian media outlet, for those who don't know.
Yeah. And they basically looked at figures from some classified Israeli military documents. And those figures showed that, 80% of Palestinians killed were civilians. So in fact, you know what? The number is not that far off. It was higher. And that much is the case.
I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, if you take The Economist, for example, which backed Israel's onslaught, their estimated figures from May, which is getting on, it's 6 months ago, the upper range was that 110,000 Palestinians in Gaza had been killed by violent means, which was excluding the number who are killed by indirect means, the collapse of the healthcare system, starvation, lack of shelter, disease, that kind of thing. That was well over twice the amount of the official death toll. And the lowest end figure was about 25,000 above the official death statistics. I mean, it's just, that's the point, is that there's overwhelming evidence, and also overwhelming evidence when it comes to women and children, that there isn't a conflict in the 21st century where that proportion of women and children have been killed. So this is just an astonishing attempt at gaslighting to suggest that, the real issue here is that there's an exaggeration of death when actually the opposite is the case.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also really interesting to me that he's choosing to focus on these numbers, and he fails to mention that even the number of Israelis killed on October 7th was revised down by the Israeli authorities from 1,400 to around 1,200. Now, shockingly, or perhaps not shockingly, despite how unreliable, the Israeli authorities are as a source, the 1,400 number was often stated without attribution. And, in comparison, the death toll out of Gaza is always mentioned with the attribution of Hamas-run health ministry. If you go and have a look on, at BBC articles from months and months ago, you will find the 1,400 number just stated, not attributed. And obviously that suggests that the BBC's maybe been able to verify it independently, something like that, because they are just stating it. And what you often see actually is the 1,400 figure stated without attribution, and directly underneath it, directly next to it, you will see the Hamas-run health ministry figure. And it's that juxtaposition that's doing a lot of really important work. And it's saying that this is a number we're not sure about, and this is a number we are really sure about, despite the fact that the October 7th number does get revised down to about 1,200. He fails to mention it.
There's another claim he talks about, which concerns the discovery of mass graves at Nasser Hospital and Al-Shifa Hospital. It should be noted that a UN report a year ago, in fact, said that there was a systematic attempt to destroy the healthcare system by Israel. And they said that this amounted to the crime of extermination, as well as other war crimes and crimes against humanity. But they said it was deliberate. There's a deliberate attempt to destroy the healthcare system in Gaza by deliberately. That's what the UN said. And this is way back. This is over a year ago. Deliberately targeting hospitals. We know about 1,700 medics have been killed. So the number of just medics, doctors, nurses, paramedics, and so on, killed in Gaza is itself much higher than the total number of people killed on October 7th. What's this claim about mass graves and at Nasser Hospital and Al-Shifa Hospital, and what's his argument and what's the reality?
Yeah, so he's looking at coverage of two BBC stories about the discovery of mass graves, so at Nasser Hospital and at Al-Shifa Hospital. And his conclusion is that, and I quote, "The most likely explanation was that the graves at both hospitals were dug by Palestinians, and the people buried there had died or been killed prior to the arrival of Israel's ground forces." And then he goes on to argue that the BBC coverage didn't reflect this. But of course, this isn't the most likely explanation at all. And, we know that for lots of different reasons, including the fact that mass graves were actually reported in the UN International Commission of Inquiry in October 2024, and it corroborated reports from the health authorities in Gaza. There's a witness in there who was involved in actually exhuming the bodies and found evidence of Israel's war crimes and crimes against humanity. And at the time, the UN also reports that among the deceased were allegedly older people, women, people who'd been wounded, and others were found with their hands tied behind their backs, stripped of their clothes. So there's that. There's also the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. And they write a report that contains some really harrowing testimonies about the fact that the Israeli military conducted, summary executions of dozens of civilians, and that includes medical personnel, that they left patients to die with lack of medical care. So there's plenty of evidence showing that all of these things did happen. He basically sort of fixates on reports of burial sites that were dug by Palestinians, but in a really different capacity and for different uses. So, there are reports, for example, of certain graves being dug because access to cemeteries was restrictive, or graves being dug because there were so many bodies. But we're really specifically talking here about bodies that were found with their hands tied behind their backs, people who looked like they'd been executed. And, there is testimony to show that is the case. Yeah, so that's a little look through some of what he's saying.
In terms of, just talking about these attacks on hospitals, and this, he says, was that the BBC should have included the evidence Israel had uncovered of Hamas operating there, which is a claim which has often been used by Israel to justify the attacks on hospitals on the basis that they're a legitimate military target. In other words, that they forfeited their civilian purpose. Just so everyone's aware, if we're going to go down this route, international law says that any attacks on civilian infrastructure like hospitals has to be, based on, for example, on missiles being fired from it. And even if that was happening, which nobody could argue was happening in Gaza, it has to be proportionate to the military aim, which is then sought. But in any case, there is no evidence that hospitals were used as command centres. And indeed, the evidence, Al-Shifa Hospital was presented by the IDF as being the command and control centre of Hamas, with a CGI video, which was we later found was used using CGI from computer games. Just tell us about this. His argument that what's this about, that the BBC should have included the evidence that Israel had uncovered of Hamas operating in hospitals, which the BBC did actually signal boost all the time, by the way, because I went through those articles myself.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's arguing that the BBC should have included what he calls, evidence Israel had uncovered of Hamas operating out of Nasser Hospital. As you said, they often did. The entire mainstream media landscape saw those claims as legitimate. But obviously right here, Prescott is misunderstanding a really crucial part of what it means to be a journalist. And being a journalist involves assessing how credible a source is. Now, at this point, there is ample evidence showing Israeli intelligence, especially around hospitals, was unreliable, and the Israeli military couldn't be trusted as a source. For example, its attack on Al-Shifa Hospital was preceded by claims that there was this multi-story Hamas headquarters directly under the medical complex. There was a sort of infographic going around. Looked quite shoddy. And ultimately, ultimately it was proven false. But that was, once Israel had attacked and entered the hospital. And in fact, this entire tunnel complex underneath this specific hospital, it wasn't there. And essentially this pattern's been repeated in hospital attacks across the Strip, to the extent that the UN Human Rights Office published a report in December 2024, and it found, and I will read this out, that in all instances where the Israeli military has attacked hospitals, apart from Al-Auda Hospital in northern Gaza and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital, Israel has alleged that the hospitals were being used by Palestinian armed groups. However, insufficient information has so far been made publicly available to substantiate these allegations, which have remained vague and broad, and in some cases appear contradicted by publicly available information. That's utterly damning. We've seen it play out again and again. To everybody listening, if you haven't watched the Gaza medics documentary that the BBC refused to air, that went out on Channel 4, please go and watch it. It shows this pattern of Israel making certain allegations about Hamas being present in a hospital, using that to go in there, and it turns out it's just not true. And Prescott would like those claims to apparently have even more airtime.
He claims that the BBC should have given more coverage to a letter signed by 600 lawyers about the British government's arms to Israel's breaching international law. Sorry, that they gave. He said they gave more coverage to that letter signed by 600 lawyers, saying the British government's arms sales to Israel breach international law in comparison to a letter written by UK lawyers for Israel, arguing the opposite. Just tell us what is he talking about UK lawyers for Israel here, and the weight he's attempting to assign to that compared to this letter signed by 600 lawyers.
I mean, look, UK lawyers for Israel is an incredibly it's an incredibly controversial group. It is not necessarily the case that it deserves wall-to-wall coverage for writing a certain letter. And it's not the case that, for example, a lot of the letters that I wrote that had, signatures from hundreds of media professionals and journalists even got any coverage at the BBC. So it's not clear to me why UK lawyers for Israel in particular would be deserving of an incredible amount of coverage.
I mean, UK lawyers for Israel back in February 2023, which was obviously long before the 7th of October attacks, they intervened to get a display of artwork by Palestinian children at the Chelsea and Westminster Hotters London removed. This was decorated plates designed by children at 2 UN schools in Gaza. And they had that artwork removed on the grounds that it made Jewish patients feel vulnerable, harassed, and victimized. That's one example of the sort of work that UK lawyers for Israel do. So, I mean, they're an extremely, I'll just say this, they're an extreme partisan pro-Israel organization. And even the likes of Piers Morgan has torn apart their main legal representative on his show for her terrible work, I would argue. And, the idea that this should be given weight compared to a letter by 600 legal specialists on the British government's arms sales to Israel. Astonishing, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clearly showing the extent of Prescott's bias and the fact that he very clearly hasn't interrogated his own biases before setting about writing something that's being called, a dossier, a report that's apparently being circulated among MPs that will be brought up in front of the Culture Committee. And, I think that across the past 2 years, we've seen the fact that even a lot of expert consensus doesn't mean that mainstream media actually reacts appropriately and perhaps looks at its editorial policy and considers how to move forward. Expert consensus isn't part of the bar anymore. And I think that should really concern us all. And it should massively concern us that Prescott wants to equate the advice of a huge number of respected experts with, the thoughts
objectively partisan, an objectively very, very, very partisan organization. There's also this claim, which is concerning the International Court of Justice, and obviously South Africa's case against Israel for genocide. And this concerns comments actually made on a BBC programme, I would just know, by the former president of the ICJ, who's one of the 16 judges on the case. And basically, the president rotates. It's chosen. You get different presidents at different time based on the 16 judges on the particular case. And where she used technical language to obscure the ICJ's findings back in January 2024. And this was about it's about language to do with the plausible risk of genocide. It's about the Genocide Convention of 1948. Do you just explain what's this about and what's the reality here?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a discussion around the kind of language that should be used in the media to talk about the ICJ ruling. And it's a bit of a thorny, a bit of a knotty topic, because obviously, look, legal jargon isn't something that a lot of people are going to understand. It is the job of a good journalist to make sure that people do understand the gravity. And, Prescott is taking issue with the phrase plausible risk of genocide, which was being used fairly often. But in fact, there are legal experts who have argued it's quite fine to state that the ICJ ruled that there was a plausible risk of genocide. Because look, in legal terms, the court will talk about putting the right not to be genocided plausibly at risk. It doesn't roll off the tongue. It's not meant to. But crucially, you can't be plausibly at risk of something, of being harmed by something that's entirely implausible, if that makes sense. So I think there's a professor at the University of Oxford, actually, Janina Dill, and she sort of explained it as there's only risk of irreparable harm to the Palestinian right to be protected from genocide if someone is plausibly threatening that right. Which is essentially to say that there's no material difference in saying there's a plausible risk of genocide versus, there's a plausible risk that one's right not to be genocided, is at risk. So, I mean, look, it's sort of semantics, but I want to talk as well about the fact that it's unacceptable for the BBC to have taken the analysis of Joan Donoghue, who's, a single one of 16 judges involved, and she did one interview on BBC Hard Talk in the summer of 2024, and that shaped the BBC's editorial policy. And in fact, it wasn't the case that they sought out a kind of expert consensus or that they sought out what the other judges perhaps thought.
Yeah. So one of them, for example, said that every red light is flashing when it comes to the threat of genocide.
Yeah, Judge Youssef, absolutely. And, why didn't that make it into our editorial policy? Because I remember at the time, in fact, that summer when I was still a BBC journalist, being sent an email that essentially told us that, hey, look, we've been making a mistake in terms of how we've been phrasing it thus far. Joan Donoghue says we shouldn't be saying it that way. So can we please listen to her advice? And that's quite shocking. That was quite shocking when I saw that in my inbox. No. So it was sort of like there's one judge, however well positioned, one judge saying one thing, and then there are other judges saying different things, and there are other legal experts saying different things. And there's no good reason I can think of for, tailoring our editorial policy around what Joan Donoghue is saying. And it didn't seem like there'd been any proper editorial discussion around, in fact, how we might phrase it so that the public will actually understand what we're talking about. And obviously, as part of all of this, when he's talking about the ICJ ruling, he absolutely fails to mention that when South Africa was actually presenting its case at the ICJ, that was given far less coverage than Israel's defense on the BBC News channel. And that disparity exists. That really did happen. And that, that was shocking in its own right.
I mean, what's so extraordinary about all of this, of course, I mean, it does feel like being gaslit to death. It's just, on the case of genocide, a consensus of genocide experts, including Israeli experts like Omar Bartov, for example, Razi Gal, have concluded that this is genocide. The Association of Genocide Scholars, I can't remember, is that the name of the group? It's something along those lines. Anyway, a vast majority of them voted to say that this was a genocide taking place. It's the consensus of Amnesty International, various NGOs like Médecins Sans Frontières, and the BBC has failed not only to foreground that, but the genocidal statements actually made by Israeli officials and leaders at the very beginning. I mean, they made, you'd fill a book the number of genocidal statements made, and these were either buried in BBC coverage or not reported on at all. When they were reported, they were, as I say, buried, and their legal implications were not actually explained. I mean, that, it's just, the BBC erased the genocidal nature of what Israel was doing, despite what the experts were saying and despite what Israeli leaders were saying.
Yeah, and it's not for want of trying in terms of, journalists inside. I remember being in a meeting where this was brought up. I remember being in a meeting where, people who are very powerful, people at the top of the organization were asked why don't we have a big documentary about all of these TikTok videos that Israeli soldiers are posting where they are blowing up houses and trying on women's underwear? Where is that documentary? Is there a reason that we haven't made that? Because we're the BBC and we certainly have the capacity and the ability. And the scale of the omission, it's left this massive accountability hole in the coverage. And a lot of people, unless they've gone and sort of sought out the evidence themselves or on social media, they're still walking around with that gap. And I'm terrified at the reality of that, because there are so many people, as you said, the BBC News website is the It has the most eyes on it, more so than any other news website. And, I think we are just beginning to come to terms with the sort of true impact of a lack of accurate coverage across 2 years.
I mean, just it does. I mean, we've talked about this a lot before, but it's worth just mentioning some of the actual catastrophic failures of BBC coverage, and that includes, for example, framing coverage around the claims of the Israeli authorities, where you will read entire articles about an attack in Gaza, and again, those were all too rarely. Many atrocities were not reported, but when they would then be framed around what the IDF says. The IDF says this, the IDF denies that, the IDF says this. Despite the objective, incontrovertible reality of the IDF lying over and over again. And sometimes you get the Western media belatedly debunking Israeli claims after attention has moved elsewhere. The BBC did not do very much of that, unfortunately. A bit of that, not enough. But, and actually other organisations like CNN and Washington Post, as bad as their coverage was, they actually did more of that. But we know they lie because there's overwhelming evidence of that. But that's one example, isn't it? Framing coverage around Israeli claims over and over and over again, despite the BBC knowing that the claims made by the IDF are not credible.
It's a really cool thing to talk about, because one of the things that we are meant to be doing as journalists is assessing the credibility of a source that's in front of us. And I think for 2 years we've been watching the mainstream media landscape refuse to assess the credibility of Israel as a source properly. And on the other hand, they are clamoring to talk about the Hamas-run health ministry. They are constantly questioning whether or not those figures are reliable. And to watch that happen on, quote unquote, one side and not on the other, again and again and again, is just been, it's been horrifying. It's been horrifying to see. It is a core, it's a very cool building block of what we do, is assessing sources.
I always come up with this example because it's just astonishing. This was 13th of November 2023. Israel's president denies it is striking Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital. Just so everyone is aware, Israel was striking Al-Shifa hospital. This was just a fact. It's just a fact as much as the earth revolves around the sun, the moon revolves around the earth, night follows day. It doesn't matter what he was saying. It was happening. But that was the headline. And then it starts, Israeli President Isaac Herzog has denied that Israel is striking the largest hospital in the Gaza Strip. The UN has said the situation at Al-Shifa hospital is dire, with constant gunfire and bombings in the area. I mean, it's just, is it happening or not? Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. I mean, part of the work journalists are meant to do is to sort of cut through disinformation, cut through whatever claims and allegations are flying around to say, look, here's what the evidence is saying, and here's a really reasonable conclusion we can come to about what is really happening. And, it's that simple, because I constantly think back to Al-Ahli Hospital, actually. Constantly, because it was the first hospital they attacked, and it sort of laid the groundwork for every hospital attack following that, or every attack really on civilian infrastructure. Because I think they were testing out the extent to which they could make any claim under the sun and it would fly. It would get repeated in mainstream media coverage. It would gain legitimacy, then providing them the cover to go in and do what they wanted to do. And I remember there was a recording they claimed showed two Hamas fighters speaking to each other. And in fact, there's a really brilliant investigation in the New Arab, which is it's a really small sort of Middle East focused publication. A really brilliant investigation in there, where they actually get Arabic speakers to listen to this clip, to listen to the audio. And, they find that the dialect is off and it doesn't really sound real and it's not credible evidence. Now, there's no reason why the BBC couldn't have done that. There were Arabic speakers at the BBC. There was no reason. So, the unwillingness to do this sort of basic, even the most basic journalism, or to question Israel as a source, just sort of, it just sort of evaporated, to the extent that if you wanted to do that, you were considered, I don't know, too emotionally close to the story, something like that.
I mean, yeah, I mean, there's just a couple of other, kind of examples there, really. I mean, that I mean, we know, for example, sorry, my cat is trying to, should we just not care? There we go. Lovely. Yeah, I mean, we mentioned, just in terms of other statistics. I mean, for example, emotive terms used 4 times more for Israeli victims, massacre 18 times more to Israeli casualties, murder 220 times used for Israeli victims, once for Palestinians. On broadcast, 1,085 Palestinians were interviewed compared to 2,350 examples. You mentioned about the Israeli perspective shared 11 times more by presenters. And to put those into figures, 2,340 times shared by presenters compared to 217 for the Palestinian perspective. 70% of all emotive terms like slaughter, barbaric, deadly, brutal, used by BBC correspondents and presenters refer to Israeli victims of attacks. I mean, that's the other point, isn't it? It's about who's given humanity and who isn't, who is humanized and who is not. And really good examples of that is, for example, after October 7th, with Israeli victims, you would get humanizing portraits of them and their families. You get, I don't know, an Israeli bomb wipes out in one go 150 Palestinians. Yeah. You don't get the stories of those Palestinians. Suddenly, here's what they were doing, their lives, their children, their loves, their hobbies, their jobs.
Yeah, I remember back in 2023, especially having to go to Al Jazeera to hear the names of the families that had been wiped out, because you wouldn't find that. You wouldn't find that in BBC coverage or in, any mainstream media coverage in the Western world. And that, I think that was incredibly hard to see. And then obviously lots of us raised concerns about the dehumanization, and, they didn't really want to do much about that. They eventually got a little bit better, but, not wonderfully so. But I think the language is really important to think about, because one of the things I've been trying to communicate is that when you have this sort of muddied, abstract language used to talk about one group of people being killed, Palestinians, it is painting a really blurry picture in the mind of the audience, of the reader of the article, whoever it is. It will paint a very blurry picture because the words, the language is very uncertain. And it's communicating that, look, we as BBC journalists don't know if this happened. We're taking a step back from it. We're reporting it because we have to. We don't know if it happened. And that's giving the audience permission to sort of disengage their empathy. And it's sort of saying, we don't know if it happened. You don't really need to care. Don't worry. And then you've got a very different language used to talk about Israelis. It's words like those you mentioned, words like slaughter, maybe words like atrocity. And these are heavy, emotive terms. They are loaded with intent. And it's always made very clear who did what to whom. And actually the picture that paints in your mind as the audience is incredibly clear. And it's so incisively and emotionally clear that it will engage your empathy. And it's sort of working at that level. You will have a very clear picture of Israelis being harmed, and it will feel sad for you. And this sort of muddied, blurred, abstract picture of Palestinians being harmed, you don't know their names, they just get killed in large numbers, or they die in large numbers. And for most people, their empathy will disengage really quickly. And that's what we've been seeing across 2 years. And now you are left with a sort of empathy gap that a lot of people have managed to bridge, by watching videos from Palestinian journalists, by going to alternative news sources, but a lot of people haven't. And, it's hugely concerning.
And what's your just final overall takeaway from just the way that this has been discussed, reported, and the way there's been an attempt to, I guess, cement the argument that the problem with BBC coverage is that it was somehow biased against Israel?
Yeah, I mean, you said it before, it's the ultimate gaslighting. It is such an absurd claim that it feels shocking that he thinks he can make it. It feels shocking that within the memo, he literally says, it seems very hard, this is a quote, it seems very hard for any pro-Palestinian observers to make a compelling case the BBC has a pro-Israel bias. I've been making that case for 2 years. You've been making that case. A lot of intelligent people paying attention have been making that case.
Mm.
And honestly, the only thing I can hope for is that there's a world in which we learn from this. But frankly, I don't see the BBC in the direction it's currently going in. I don't see it. I don't see it necessarily learning from this, but I'm just glad that there is an alternative media landscape that actually took on the burden of actually being journalists, and has strengthened. And the thing is that every time I go to a university or a school or wherever it is I go to give a talk or to be on a panel, I get young people coming to me, people who are doing their journalism degrees, and they are often saying, look, I would have wanted to work for the BBC because I care about public service and I care about journalism, but I don't want to be there anymore. That's not where I want to go. Where do I go now? And, I'm directing them to this sort of growing alternative media landscape, and I'm hoping it continues to grow. But
same, it's very important we build it, and I think that is particularly in an increasingly dark age. That has to be the way forward. And by the way, an alternative media landscape which always sticks consistently to the facts and to the truth. It's not like the right-wing media landscape, the far-right media landscape, which is based on lies and fear and hatred, sticking to the truth and being rigorous, as well as, confronting those with power. Karishma, honestly, it's been such an honor as ever. Your voice is so important. Your voice keeping lots of people sane, and when there's a deliberate attempt to turn the world on its head. And we're not going to let that happen. And actually, I think it's striking if you look at the polling in Britain and elsewhere, that despite the best efforts of these media outlets to turn reality on its head, actually, people know enough, more than enough. They work
I think
more
the
than
empathy
enough.
gap is really closing. I think people have gone and sought out the truth. So,
yeah, which is why, even in America, about half the population think Israel's committed genocide compared to 35% who don't. People managed to find the truth, but they had to look for it. And that is deeply disturbing when the truth was always obvious from the very beginning. So do share this video, get the message out, press like and subscribe and leave comments. Do engage, help us, engagement is very important. But yeah, Karishma, honestly, really, really appreciate your voice as ever. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Always.